Reacting to all the biggest storylines from early free agency. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. Quick plug. I wrote an article called Reacting to Early Free Agency. It's got like a dozen blurbs, a ton of takes. I'm going to mention a lot of them on the show today, but something you can get over at the newsletter, bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz, including, as we've talked about in the last several shows, the amazing rookie guide, which is the thing that you want to be making sure to pick up right now, in addition to all the other great stuff at RotoViz. But the rookie guide, definitely a must-have. Shawn, ton of stuff has happened. We are talking right now in the early to, I guess, later afternoon on the West Coast. It's more like evening on the East Coast on Tuesday. We're still in the legal tampering period. Of course, the legal tampering period, we get all the reports of all the deals that have already been negotiated within minutes of the legal tampering period open. We find about all the deals that have already been negotiated during what is supposed to be the illegal tampering period. This is supposed to be the time that teams are talking to players, and then free agency is supposed to open on Wednesday, but it is not yet Wednesday. And some of the free agency lists, some of the people I've been following on social that have made the list, they're like, yeah, all my top 10 players are already accounted for. And like 2/3 of my top 50. Basically, all the players are gone. A lot of the people that are paying quite a bit of attention to this year's free agent class have mentioned that it's not a very deep class. Free agency is basically over, is what I'm getting at. Most everybody has signed in this legal tampering period. There's still some dominoes to fall as we're recording. We are waiting on a couple big ones, guys like Aaron Rodgers, see maybe where Russell Wilson's going to land. As of now, Rodgers is being rumored to Pittsburgh, possibly to the Giants. Sounds like if he goes to Pittsburgh, maybe Russell Wilson lands with the Giants. I'm not entirely sure what happens with those teams. The Giants, desperate for a quarterback, certainly. Kirk Cousins is still out there. He's being rumored to the Browns, but I wonder if they would make a push for him. Who knows? There's a couple receivers that are going to become available. Cooper Kupp's going to get cut. Stephon Diggs looks like he might be leaving the Texans after Christian Kirk was acquired via trade. A ton has happened. A lot of other quarterbacks have already moved. It's fascinating because it's, what I'm trying to describe, I guess, is you're 36 hours into the legal tampering period. And for all intents and purposes, other than the rookies that come in via the draft, we've seen like 75% of the veteran movement that we're going to see this offseason now. I mean, we have a pretty good idea now of what the league is going to look like in 2025 from a veteran standpoint, what players are changing teams, and what are the conversations going to be for the rest of the summer now, in these different setups as it laid out. The fascinating sort of high-level stuff, a lot of teams had a lot of cap because the cap has risen by a ton over the last couple of years in a way that was even more than was expected. You have a few teams that didn't have the cap. So you have teams like the 49ers had to let a lot of people go, and they basically all got signed elsewhere. But what we saw with the teams that did have cap is there was a lot of re-signing at the last minute, at the 11th hour, like the Vikings brought back Aaron Jones at the last minute. That happened with a lot of other positions as well. The Vikings also brought back Byron Murphy, who was a cornerback who I know a lot of people were hoping from fans of other teams were hoping they might grab Byron Murphy as a potential free agent cornerback. He winds up back in Minnesota. Minnesota spends to also bring in multiple defensive tackles. One of the interesting ones there, Jonathan Allen, they bring him in. The Commanders cut him. The Commanders had the cap space to bring back Jonathan Allen, but decided to let him go. And he's supposed to be a very high level player. I wonder if there was a personality clash there or something. He's been outspoken in the past. Vikings had multiple interior defensive linemen, multiple interior offensive linemen. Bears did similar. You got two teams in the NFC North really gearing up to handle the interior of the trenches, which I think is really fascinating. But yeah, before we got to free agency, we had a bunch of teams re-signing players, which further weakened the free agent crop. But we do have some trades that have occurred, Shawn. We have some players that have definitely changed teams, some guys that were free agents. We were talking, sort of what I'm saying there is we were talking in the last show about this widening gap between, we've been talking about the haves and have-nots for several years, but you're talking about these all-star teams, these super teams. Vikings are a great example of a team that was able to go out and spend a lot of money, retain some of their talent, bring in a lot of talent, There's other teams that were in tough situations, had to let guys go. And it's not a great spot to be in right now because everyone else has money to spend. They're kind of losing a lot of talent in some of those cases. So that was one observation I had. It seemed like we're maybe potentially seeing that widen, that same point that you were talking about, the teams that are able to attract players, because some teams who have cap to spend seem like they can't find ways to spend it either. And there may be the less attractive situations around the league, but a team like the Commanders has been able to attract, some players. It's all very fascinating. It's been a very fascinating first 36 hours. There's a lot to discuss. We could talk about this for 3 hours, and I should probably kick it to you because I already talked for 5 minutes, but there is going to be a lot that we don't get to. I just wanted to mention as the last thing, and we'll talk about it throughout the summer, right? Like we're going to get to this stuff as we get to it. But how you doing? How's it going?
Good. You tend to view for free agency, I think, both globally and then in terms of what you're most specifically interested in. I was mentioning to you that the move that doesn't matter, but raised my eyebrows and is the one that I do care about because I'm so desperately hoping that the Chiefs actually draft a star running back or a running back, right? I mean, then I have a 4-round rookie mock draft coming out on the site for anybody who doesn't want to buy the rookie guide. And again, why would you not? You're going to get basically that same amount free back off of your subscription. But that's going to be up. We go through it. And there are so many running backs in this class. I don't see how adding Elijah Mitchell blocks them in any way, shape, or form. But running back seems like the very last position you would ever spend on in 2025 free agency. And that probably helps us explain some of the things with Najee Harris and what he ran into. Now, this is something where I think it boosts his situation dramatically, even though the Chargers didn't run the ball that effectively last season. But if there is one squad in the entire NFL where Najee Harris would be not just a good fit, but arguably a great fit, it seems like it is the Chargers. This is a guy who has been consistently outclassed by Jaylen Warren. This is a player who, through 4 NFL seasons, has now posted negative fantasy points over expectation 4 consecutive times. He's not dramatically below like some of the guys where you really, really don't want to have them as your starter. He does break a lot of tackles. He does have some athleticism that doesn't translate into yards. But, I mean, Marshawn Lynch actually played a long time in the NFL before his broken tackles and athleticism started to actually translate into yards. The player he was with the Seahawks was a completely different guy than the player earlier in his career. Then what have the Chargers purchased here? Is it a good value? And what are we looking at going forward?
I think the contract is great from the Chargers' perspective. It fascinated me because I thought it was light from Harris's perspective, especially because he agreed to it on the first day of the legal tampering period, where it's like kind of signaling that there's not a huge market out there. This guy's already 27 years old. You would think that he'd be prioritizing multiple years at this stage and guaranteed money. And what he got was a 1-year deal. They initially commented that it was up to a max value of $9.25 million. And then the later details that came out were that was a pretty big split. Whenever we hear that up to, we know that there's, okay, how much of it is guaranteed, how much of it is incentives. Pretty big split there. The guarantees are $5.25 million, and then there's $4 million of incentives. We don't have the list of incentives yet, but typically with running backs, they're pretty high. And especially with a guy like him, the big thing for Najee, the one thing he has going for him is that he's been, people love to say the greatest ability is availability. He's been available. I saw a message, a social media post at some point, and there's been so much stuff kicked around. I apologize. I'm not going to cite my source as well, but I saw a post that said that he was the only running back that has played, I believe it was every game of the last 4 years, all 17 games the last 4 years. And I saw another one that was the stat that was, I think, even more widely circulated, which was he became, I believe, only the 5th running back to start their career with 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons, 1,000-yard rushing seasons to be specific. The other 4 are all like great running backs, right? I mean, typically speaking, if you do that, you're going to be good. In his case, it's in part because he got 280 plus touches all 4 years with Pittsburgh. He played every game. He was healthy all throughout his Steelers tenure and got a lot of work. And when you have a first round back, the NFL tends to like care about durability and care about workhorse traits. They've paid underwhelming backs that handled a lot of work, that had draft capital for years. We've seen that type of a thing. And so it's surprising to me that he had to settle on the first day for a 1-year contract. It's one thing if you have to linger a little bit, but it's like I talked about that illegal tampering period where teams are obviously talking. It seems like he got a pretty clear signal that there's not going to be a lot of opportunity out there for him. And people might say, well, maybe he's just trying to bet on himself 1 year with the Chargers. He's going to be 28 when he hits free agency next year. Do you think he's going to get a multi-year, $10+ million of guarantees as a 28-year-old back? He's going to have a huge year. Now, maybe that
we are starting to move into a moment in time where the most recent backs to age into this range have done better than even just if you look at the span a couple of years ago. When you start to think about, Alvin Kamara continues to get paid. Aaron Jones is somebody I thought the Vikings would see as potentially replaceable at the cost of almost nothing. Again, they're going to be day 3 backs in this class that are clear starters and essentially cost you nothing. Every $1 million that you spend at running back or to sign Josh Palmer, you can't use to sign players who move the needle for you, right? So it's not just like a handful of $1 million. Doesn't matter. You want to outbid your opponent for that guy who really helps, and the extra $2, $3, $4 million makes the difference there. There's so many freebies in this draft at running back. So you have both of those things, but do you think the fact that we're having older backs perform better and then get some bigger contracts, it may just be that we're in a moment where this year was going to be so bad for free agents, but if you perform well, not that you're going to get a Saquon Barkley type of thing, and there's no world in which Najee Harris is Saquon Barkley, right? And this is a guy averaged 17.7 points per game as a rookie when he was also heavily involved as a receiver. 12.4 in the 3 seasons since, only an RB1 22% of the time. He should blow those numbers away with the Chargers. But yeah, it is tricky because you can only really bet on yourself if your 75th percentile or certainly 95th percentile result is going to get you a big contract. Is that possible for him? I've said it's not, but maybe that's not true.
I don't know. You just said he's going to blow his numbers away with the Chargers. I think that's an interesting take in itself. I think it's one of the best situations in landing spots. I feel like the way that I wrote it up is that most people are going to look at this as, okay, who are the running backs that are currently on the roster, which is nobody, basically. They cut Gus Edwards. J.K. Dobbins is a free agent. What's his competition, et cetera, and not pay as much attention to the contract, which I do think is pretty significant. Now, the Chargers obviously did value him. They're paying him $5.25 million guaranteed. But I see a 1-year deal at that price, and I don't see the commitment. The point that I'm trying to drive home with it being surprisingly low is I don't think he would have agreed for anything lower, basically. Like, I think this is the bottom of the scale of what we could have expected for all the reasons you just said. We have older backs that are getting paid. Agents are doing their job too. They're going to be like, he's a former first-round pick that's handled 280-plus touches and stayed healthy for 4 straight years. Look at all these other backs that are getting paid so much more. Aaron Jones just got a contract extension that's at least I think it was a 2-year, $20 million or something. Can't remember exactly what the numbers were there, but I think it was at least about $10 million per year, and it's multiple years. The fact that Najee couldn't get multiple years, couldn't get closer to at least $10 million guaranteed. That's where the number I would have expected was around $10 million guaranteed, not an up to $9 million. That turns out that it's really only $5 million guaranteed. and particularly that second year, even if it was just a tack-on year where he was likely to get cut, but he had a couple mil in dead money that he'd still get paid out or whatever. They bring him in for $1 million. To me, one of the things I was curious about with the Chargers this offseason is whether they would attack a more dynamic back. Last offseason, they brought in Edwards and Dobbins. Dobbins coming off multiple injuries is the closest thing to dynamic that they went after. They drafted Kamani Vidal in the 6th round. He obviously didn't necessarily pan out. Edwards has since been released. Dobbins has a great year for a guy who's coming off all these injuries, but also looks like a dude that's probably not massively dynamic. Now, if he comes back, I like his athleticism and like playmaking more than Najee Harris is probably. I mean, I think they'll both get touches, but my issue for Najee Harris is he's been a volume dependent back who I think at this cost on this deal is going to need to continuously earn work. He's not going to just be handed work in the way that his draft capital, I think, for the Steelers often got that done. And so then he has to be better. You're talking about the possibility that he could be in the Chargers scheme. Maybe he will be, but he has to be better to continue to earn work. But even if it's, well, particularly if it's not Dobbins, I think that's sort of the best case is if they bring Dobbins back. But the way I'm looking at it is they sign him to a 1-year deal. He makes a lot of sense as a pairing with a rookie still. Now, I don't know if they're going to go attack a dynamic rookie, but this is a deep class. But if you bring in a rookie and you have Najee Harris for the first year and you're sort of playing them together, and then you're like, all right, well, we're going to let Najee Harris go. And 2026 and beyond, he's your star back, right? That's a situation that you don't like for Najee Harris, in my opinion, because that's a situation where throughout the year in 2025, because he's a pending free agent, the rookie's going to be getting more opportunities as the future. And if the rookie's just better, he's going to just displace him entirely by mid-season. I mean, so I was telling people that Najee Harris, I remember in an early offseason ship chasing episode that Najee Harris was a good value. He's like a 10th or 11th round pick, I think, in the early underdog stuff, and a good value there because I thought he'd land somewhere, or I felt like he was going to get volume again based on what he's been able to do through 4 years, based on the draft capital and all this stuff. Where he lands now to me is like he's going to be in a committee and probably the guy that I want to bet against in the committee from a talent perspective. And they're not going to be committed to him beyond this year. So they're not going to, there's some thought that maybe they would ride him into the ground or something, but they want to win. And if it's mid-season and they're in a good spot, I think they're going to be improved this year from a win-loss record standpoint. They're going to push their chips towards the player that's really good. Now, I talked about how they addressed the running back position last year through 3 sort of broken parts, a 6th round pick and 2 free agents that nobody else really wanted. They got cheap. Maybe that's their approach again, and Najee's now the lead of that group. And if that's the case, then he's sort of in an okay spot because the Chargers are going to run the ball quite a bit. I'm hoping that what they did last offseason is not what they do this offseason in the sense that they actually do think that the running back position, like you were saying with the Chiefs, is one that they need to address, which means they take a day 2 rookie instead of a round 6 rookie. They take somebody who's actually a dynamic player in this deep rookie class. If they do that, I'm going to bet on that guy over 27-year-old Najee Harris.
One of the things that's tricky, I think, if you're the Chargers, is that you are potentially going to be very good, and yet you still have a lot of needs. And to catch up with the Chiefs, to hold off the Broncos, you have a lot of things you need to address. I don't know that you can make this move, even though it's not a huge move, and then still get back in and get the kind of back that you need. That what you were describing there sounded very much to me like Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. This class has so many players that you can potentially get Jahmyr Gibbs later, but the actual Jahmyr Gibbs was drafted super early and the Lions were criticized for it, arguably even justifiably, despite the fact that it's worked out pretty well. I mean, right now, what you would really want to criticize them for is why do you keep re-signing David Montgomery when that style of player is going to be available in the 6th and 7th round of this upcoming draft? Harris has a lot to prove. As I mentioned, he does come through with these really high broken tackle rates. Occasionally that will translate into some good performances, but the actual fantasy performances from Harris are pretty shocking in that I mentioned where he's been the last 3 years. You mentioned he's played in all the games. That means over the last 3 seasons, he's played 51. In those 51 games, but he only has 7 games above 17 points in PPR for fantasy. So when I say he's going to be better, I think that his odds of cresting that 17-point threshold in a way that helps fantasy managers does improve. And yet,
yeah,
this is one where actually it seems like the NFL did a better job of evaluating and simply realized this is not an elite back.
That's right. That's what's so surprising to me, because this is one that they typically get wrong, right? Because of the past draft capital, because of the workload element. And they seem to evaluate it well. The other side of that, the fact that nobody necessarily wanted to pay this and doesn't necessarily speak to what the Chargers are going to do. And I think you make a great point that Gibbs was a high pick, and maybe they can't take the type of difference making back that I'm talking, because you probably got to get one of the top guys. I mean, I'm envisioning that they end up with like Omari and Hampton, but they can't maybe do that, right? And so if they're doing a round 3 back, that player may not be good enough to immediately displace Najee Harris, right? I mean, so there's the question there. But I do think the league, no one else being willing to pay a bunch of money here, is telling you that they think this rookie running back class is very good. And a lot of teams want to address it there. But yeah, I mean, Javonte Williams, who we've talked about, did not look good last year. And look, he was a bet on coming back from a major injury and looking a lot better than he did the year prior, and that Sean Payton really liked him and was going to use him a lot. And we also thought the position would potentially have a ton of targets, but it didn't work out that way in this offense. Williams got played late into the year over Jaleel McLaughlin, over Audric Estime, in situations where you're like, how are you still playing Javonte? So that part of the thesis was true. The efficiency sort of free roll upside that was, I think, present in that bet, like I'll always defend the Javonte bet, it was just as catastrophic on the efficiency side as it could possibly be. He looked completely done. He got a 1-year, $3 million, $3.5 million with incentives, $3 million. The way that was written, I read it as $3 million guaranteed, because it's 3.5 max from the Cowboys. That's like,
then I was not super high on Rico Dowdle, and he did a little bit more than I was expecting. I wasn't super low on him either. I just didn't think that it was the right type of bet for them to make. And then by extension, with some of the other uninteresting pieces and just this possibility they wouldn't run a lot, which we did actually get and was a problem. But I mean, there's no question that he's better than Javonte Williams. I love Javonte Williams. I don't want this to sound nasty to Javonte Williams. Before the injury, he was going to be an absolute star.
Right.
This makes no sense. I mean, this is a situation where those $3 million can be spent in some other way. You do still have a cap. It's not unlimited. If you have $3 million you don't want, you could do giveaways to fans.
Yeah.
Right?
And
Javonte Williams should never be on the field for you. It's going to hurt you. You cannot spend the money that way.
It's crazy. And they also refuse to spend anywhere else. So this is, especially with the Cowboys, I mean, fans are like, if we're going to give out $3 million to something, like, please make it an impact player, because this is a very replaceable piece at this point. Unfortunately, it's an injury-related replaceable piece. It's a very sad story. We were very in on him last year. Both of us took a lot of Javonte Williams, watched a lot of Javonte Williams, wanted to see Javonte Williams look a lot better than he did. My point in bringing up that contract in conjunction to Harris's is, again, like, you're talking about the league was willing to tell you that Javonte Williams is worth like not that much less than Najee guaranteed, which is just very surprising. I mean, like we said, the league seems to be evaluating the situation correctly as it relates to Najee Harris, but and overvaluing Javonte, frankly. But that's my point about, like, a veteran running back, second contract with some type of pedigree is usually going to get at least something, especially if they sign early on day one, right? That's what Javonte got. On day one, somebody wanted to pay him $3 million and thinks he still has. I mean, this is the way Jerry Jones does everything. He doesn't pay attention to the NFL. He's like, well, we liked him as a prospect. Like, they went and traded a 4th round pick for Jonathan Mingo because they liked him when he was a 2nd round pick, not paying attention to the fact that he's been horrible since then. And you can like him as a 2nd round pick, which was probably wrong process in the first place, but also acknowledge that he's not worth a 4th round pick multiple years later when he's done nothing and he's a bust. And that's what we just got again here, was Javonte Williams being paid like he's a nice, interesting buy low, but you haven't been paying attention to what he's been doing coming off of that injury these last couple of years. He has not looked, frankly, like he can really play at the NFL level anymore, which is, again, very unfortunate. Dowdle's a better player than him, as you said. You still hope, if you're a Cowboy fan, they add another piece. It's not a deal that's going to prevent that by any means, but That's the type of veteran contract that's going to be signed on day one. It's just so surprising to me that Najee didn't get more, not because I think Najee is good, but because that's the way the league usually does it. It doesn't necessarily speak particularly well to Najee, and I do think there's more fragility there than a lot of the other immediate responses that I saw. Let's talk about the quarterbacks, Sean, because we talked on the last show about Geno Smith. We talked about that Seattle probably wasn't going to be winning a Super Bowl with Geno Smith. And yet, as I wrote their moves, I wrote about how their moves are kind of hard to follow for me, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. They do trade Geno Smith. They trade him for a late third. A lot of observers were like, Geno Smith's better than this. This is maybe not a return that is commensurate with his value. Then they decide they want to trade DK Metcalf, and this all happened since we last got an opportunity to talk. They wind up trading him for a round 2 pick. I had some thoughts on social about the initial offer that there was at least one team willing to give up a 3, and then Seattle wanted a 1 and a 3. They land on a 2. A lot of people were responding to that. A lot of people were sharing on social. Why would you trade even a 2 for DK Metcalf when you have to pay him the monster contract? That was a very common perspective on Metcalf, Sean. I had the opposite take, which was I felt like Seattle sold him a little bit low from the perspective of there's no real good way to add a wide receiver this offseason. It's a thin rookie class. There's no one on the free agent market other than everyone really wanted Chris Godwin, but he winds up back with the Bucks. And as soon as he went back to the Bucks, I saw multiple tweets that said the wide receiver market just dried up. Like that was basically it. You mentioned Josh Palmer getting this 3-year, $36 million deal from the Bills. We saw Tutu Atwell and De'Ami Brown both get 1-year, $10 million deals, significantly more than Najee Harris. I mean, these types of things were happening this offseason. This is not a very good wide receiver free agent group. Teams are trading for guys like Christian Kirk to try to, address this type of situation. Deebo Samuel gets moved in a trade. Metcalf becomes available. Seattle trades him before free agency. And now you have fans that are like, how do the New England Patriots not address, I see their fans on social media. How do they not address wide receiver? They should have paid Chris Godwin twice as much as the Bucs did, done anything they possibly could have to get Drake May, Chris Godwin. Maybe they'll still land a Stephon Diggs or a Cooper Kupp or something, and presumably also address it in the draft again because their last draft class was not very exciting. I think they made these moves early because they wanted 2025 picks. I don't think they want to rebuild. And I think it gets harder to get current year picks as you get closer to the draft. And certainly if you would have held Metcalf past the draft, you can't make a trade for 2025 picks. Now you're trading for 2026 draft capital, 2027. Both the Geno and Metcalf picks were notably this year. And then they signed Sam Darnold. That's the other part of the Geno thing that I think is so interesting is you go away from Geno. I don't hate that necessarily for the reasons we talked about in the last show, the lack of mobility. He's a good player, but can you really get to the ceiling you need? But one thing Geno did really well, we've talked about a lot, was he overcame the fact that they didn't protect him particularly well. What we saw from Sam Darnold late last year is when they stopped being able to protect him, he was terrible in week 18 and in the playoff game. And then Seattle did not make any of these big signings on the offensive line, which if you're going to go to Darnold, you got to be able to address the offensive line. It seems like this whole new scheme is going to be, they're going to a Clint Kubiak scheme. Obviously there's the Shanahan ties with the Kubiak family, outside zone. Maybe they'll do some of the play action, short passing, run after the catch stuff that the Niners are known for. Maybe some of that will help Darnold, move around a little bit and not be getting hit so much. But the way that I'm writing it up is, and thinking about it is, what are you going to do in the fourth quarter when you're down and you have to drop back and throw and there's pressure and you have Sam Darnold at quarterback now? I mean, that's the thing that Geno Smith was able to offer you, and you no longer have that. I don't think it's a surprise that the Saints in weeks 1 and 2 were as good as they were last year under Clint Kubiak. When they were playing from ahead, they dominated those games. And then once they started to get, they had a bunch of injuries later in the year, but once they started to get, because remember how good they were weeks 1 and 2, but once they started to get into some of those games where they're trailing in obvious pass situations, that offense that is idealistic, that you can build through running and play action and everything, starts to break down when you have to just drop back and throw and have to do the things that if you're going to win a Super Bowl, for example, you have to be able to do in the playoffs. I mean, that's, people are asking, is Matt Stafford washed up? And I referenced his game against the Eagles. The last we saw him, they had 5 minutes left. They're down 13. He drives them down the field in obvious pass situations against probably the toughest defense in the NFL to do that against. We saw in the Super Bowl that they could rush 4 and get at Patrick Mahomes at will. He drives down the field. He's getting chunk pass plays against a team that can rush 4 and drop 7 and gets a TD drive. They get the ball back. He drives them all the way back down to the 13 and nearly wins that game in Philadelphia, and would have been an upset. I think that was some of the best quarterbacking we saw all season, what Matthew Stafford was able to do in a loss in the final 5 minutes of that playoff game. That's what you have to be able to do. That's what Sam Darnold, I have no faith, is going to be able to do. Maybe you can at least get that from Geno. So what is Seattle doing? Trading Geno, trading Metcalf, when I think if you hold out for desperation, we know that NFL teams are desperate. And I get observers' perspective that trading a lot of draft capital and then paying a player is a lot, but teams have been willing to do that. We've been talking about it since your Chiefs traded a ton for Frank Clark to the Seahawks and then paid him a massive deal. That's been not the way to do it over the years, but teams have been willing to do that. And there is cap availability around the league right now. I bring up the Patriots because that's a team that hasn't found a way to spend their money. If you waited a little bit, maybe they would have eventually given you a first. Maybe it would have been a future first. I don't know. But maybe you would have got a first round pick out of them so that they could then extend DK Metcalf, because they can afford to extend DK Metcalf. That's what all their fans are saying about the Godwin thing. We could have paid him $30 million a year. Who cares? I mean, we need to spend our money and we need talent on our roster for Drake May. So the whole thing to me with Seattle, they seem to be reimagining the team in their own image. They're reimagining it in Clint Kubiak's scheme. They want to run 2 tight ends. They want to go 2 receivers. I'd like to believe this is all great for Jackson Smith and Jigba. I don't think they're doing it well. I'm concerned. I'm a big fan of Mike McDonald. I think he's not going to make it through 2 years of Sam Darnold. I think this team has gotten a lot worse. They have not addressed the offensive line. They've gotten worse at the quarterback position, but spent money on it. So you're not now, at least making a high upside swing on a Justin Field or something. You no longer have DK Metcalf. You don't have a lot of help for JSN. You're going to try to run the ball and play from ahead, but your defense wasn't particularly good last year. Maybe McDonald can fix all of that. What are they doing? Is the current year round 2 and round 3 pick enough to have gotten rid of Geno and DK Metcalf? Are they going to be able to address all of their holes that they need to in the draft? Are they just going to hit on a bunch of day 2 offensive linemen and rework their whole offensive line with rookies? I mean, I guess I don't know what to think about all of this, but I think they've gotten it significantly worse.
One of the things that's a little bit tricky for me to square with my viewing of the Seahawks is that some of the sites, the sources that I look at for offensive line performance don't necessarily think that the Seahawks were as bad in run blocking or in pass blocking as it would seem, which is another potential reason that you get a new offensive coordinator. It's a potential reason why you get a new QB. Having said all of that, I mean, so many of these moves to me have appeared to be at least mild lose-lose types of moves, because the teams that are trading for players are then, in many, if not most cases, extending them at more or less market value. Now, you have some control over them once you've traded for them. So it's probably still, well below what they could get if they were purely on the free agent market. But at that point, I mean, certainly any contract that a player signs in free agency, they don't just have no trade value. They have negative trade value because the team that was willing to pay them the most now has them, right? So in these cases where you're able to get picks at all for players that the team you're trading them to has to pay, and you no longer have to pay, they probably overpaid you. At the same time, so it's a bad move for the team acquiring the player, but it's also a bad move for you because you did have leverage by virtue of having them on your roster in the first place. You could have used them while you still had them or use that leverage to create better global situation within your salary cap, what have you. Again, you have the leverage to do some of these things. And
to that point
out, you don't create holes that now you have to overpay in a different way to fix.
Right. And to that point about the leverage that you have, the other thing about Metcalf that's so fascinating to me that I didn't understand, people were saying that he's only worth a third rounder because somebody else has to pay him. he's going to get paid in free agency if he doesn't get traded and extended. We just talked about wide receivers like him don't hit free agency. If you keep him for another year, he play and don't extend it. Maybe he holds out, whatever. He's got to play eventually. He plays for you this year, right? He adds value to your team in 2025, and then he walks, and then he signs a huge deal that absolutely gets you a round 3 the top compensatory value. It's a big enough deal. You're getting a round 3 compensatory pick. Now that's in 2026 free agency, so it becomes a 2027 pick. At the end of the 3rd round, I do understand that there's a difference between a 2025 round 2 and a 2027 end of the 3rd round compensatory pick. But when you were talking about the leverage, you may be able to trade him later. Worst case scenario, he plays for you for the year and you're getting a round 3 because someone's paying him a big enough contract in free agency next year. That's the other part of it. I was like, why would he be worth a round 3 now if he's worth a round 3 if he walks in free agency based on the compensatory system?
Well, you contrast a lot of these moves with one of the ones that maybe you can explain to me. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe Joe Thuney is more valuable to the Chiefs than to other teams. Maybe the fact about some of the things they did with him this season and that certainly that he's aging. But this is a stark contrast to what Ben Johnson and company are doing, where both the Commanders and the Bears seem to be having a very good offseason to this point. You talk about the Chiefs and some of the problems that these good teams have. You referenced the 49ers and how they're having to let people go. Chiefs obviously deciding between their 2 all-pro caliber guards. One gets franchised and gets a huge amount of money. The other one gets shipped off, not for a 2025 4th-round pick, but for a 2026 4th-round pick. Eventually, Ben, these picks do arrive and you get to spend them. And the Chiefs are the type of team that even though they're deep, they also need to find cheap ways to fill out their roster. And those picks between rounds 2, round 4, you would love for those picks to hit because that's kind of in that sweet spot between what you have to pay and the realistic chance to actually get a big impact player. And yet, when you think about the Bears and how they're trying to build around Caleb Williams and just how little they've actually spent, they now have flexibility for that move to work in a variety of ways for them. One of the things we've sort of been discussing here is you don't want to paint yourself into a corner where the move that you make has to hit on a really high outcome just to even be a wash.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely should be judging these moves or thinking about these moves in the same ways that we talk about like fantasy football, range of outcomes and various probabilities and those types of things. And that ultimately is where I'm at when I go back to the Seahawks, where like the Darnold thing. Like I think so. Sam Darnold had a good year last year, 15 great games and then 2 really bad games at the end. Now, a big red flag for me is that Kevin O'Connell basically immediately after the last game was like, we had a great experience with Sam this year. We were on this journey with him, and however things go in the offseason, I hope, he continues to grow and said all these awesome things. I think we talked about it on the show. I took that as like, he was like, because I think Kevin O'Connell is an awesome coach and a good human.
Ben, were you thinking to yourself that the Vikings are now wondering if they could get Sam Howell and do the same with him, and then someone will pay him $100 million when, he's already on the Seahawks roster. You just paid $100 million for somebody who is probably not an upgrade on the backup quarterback that you already had. Important numbers, I think, for Darnold. You talk about the early games, and he did do a lot of things, but he had this situation that was so incredible. This is a team that in the time to pressure numbers that Blair Andrews uses for his matchups column, last year, the Vikings were inside the top 10, right? So they're making opponents really wait to get pressure. And despite that, the actual pressure rate was 29th in the NFL, in part because the time to throw was 29th in the NFL. You can't be 29th in the NFL when you have the best receiving core in the NFL. You're playing in a dome. You've got a great coach. And you're not a scrambling QB, right? It's the scrambling QBs who have the really high time to throws. The pocket passers, not only can you not have that as your stat, you can't be even in that vicinity. This means you can't actually start for like 25 of the 32 NFL teams because you simply won't be surrounded with enough talent to be effective at all.
Right. And this is the exact range of probabilities thing I was going to say. We got a good year from Darnold, good production, but as you're saying, nothing that says that he definitely turned a corner. And again, you compare him to like a Geno Smith, which is fascinating. 2 reclamation projects. Geno Smith only started 31 games early in his career before he came to Seattle and became a starter again well into his 30s. So he's like not even 2 full seasons in his like early years. He's a first round pick. Most of those were in his rookie year and his second year. And then he basically wasn't a starter again. Sam Darnold got starts in multiple seasons across multiple teams. He got another chance with Carolina. Everyone's just like, oh, he was with the Jets. Now he got a chance with Carolina to be their guy and was even worse. 55 mostly terrible starts by the end of his age 25 season in 2022. Then he sits for 2023 in San Francisco, plays in week 18, 1 game. And then in 2024, he gives us the good year. Again, Geno only started the 31 games, and now we've seen him start for like 3 seasons. Darnold, we've seen 1. We have the floor here. We talk about range of probabilities. Darnold probably in a good system that like he knows he's familiar with. There's all this talk about, he played under Shanahan. That's part of why Kevin O'Connell was interested because there's familiarity in the system, and then he had a good year, and now Clint Kubiak, and it's all the McShanny systems. That's part of why they wanted to go to Darnold was the system-based conversation. Man, I really think this is an asymmetrical bet where you're like small win, big loss. There's a possibility that he's just a total pumpkin again immediately, and you can't protect him anymore. You just talked about how the Vikings did a really good job of protecting him. A random anecdote at the end of the year, Sean, it came across my social feed from the official NFL account that Sam Darnold won some fan vote for best pass of the season, right? Best throw of the entire year. And it was the long, like 98-yard touchdown to Justin Jefferson, where Jefferson catches it around midfield and then has to kind of stop and change directions and runs all the way back to the other pylon for the TD. And I watched the play a couple times on loop, and I ended up having to quote tweet this and like write a little comment. And I'm like, Darnold, you were talking about the time to throw. Jefferson gets behind the defense entirely. And Darnold has a clean pocket. He's in the end zone, completely clean pocket. He's stepping up into and he's staring down where he's going to eventually throw the ball. Finally gets it out. Doesn't have the arm strength to throw it on stride with Justin Jefferson. It's a half step behind him. It's not a horrible throw. Obviously, if it had wound up getting voted the best throw of the year, it wasn't a terrible throw, but it wasn't perfectly in stride. Jefferson had to slow down and then eventually has to cut back after the catch. 2 defenders get out ahead of him. It's not the best throw of the year if your receiver has to make a move after the catch to then get to the end zone when he was behind the defense because you didn't get the ball out to the best receiver in the league who's running wide open and you're in a clean pocket. I mean, come on. I wrote that I understand it's a fan vote, but if there was 50 throws in this vote, that throw shouldn't have been on it. It's a deep throw. It's a long touchdown. It's also very indicative of some of what Sam Darnold experienced this year. It happened with Jordan Addison as well. This team has the best skill players in the NFL. It's the best wide receiver duo in the NFL. It's better than A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. It's better than Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. Jordan Addison, and in his age 22 season, just backed up in an elite age 21 season after winning the Biletnikoff at age 18 or whatever, 19, and having another great college season on a different team. I mean, he's not a smart guy off the field. We've had a lot of issues with drinking and driving and stuff. Jordan Addison is a budding superstar. I mean, this guy is playing at a really high level that is overshadowed by Justin Jefferson, who's the best receiver in the league. Then you have a top 10 tight end in the league. Then you have Aaron Jones. I mean, this is an incredible cast around an offensive behind an offensive line as well that you said was protecting them. I think JJ McCarthy is going to have a great year. I think whether he's good or not is almost irrelevant because Kevin O'Connell, I think, is that good of a coach. What he was able to coax out of Darnold, I think, speaks really well to what they're going to get out of JJ McCarthy. But I do think it's fascinating that he immediately was like, we want to move on from Darnold and we want to move toward a year 2 player who has not played a snap at the NFL level and is coming off a knee injury. And I thought about this a lot. I think their reasoning for that was they wanted to signal to their preferred backup option, which I believe was probably Daniel Jones, that the number 2 job was wide open. Daniel Jones wound up coming down to the Colts and Vikings and he ended up signing with the Colts. Vikings now have no option, really. I mean, they might go to like a Jameis Winston or something as far as who's going to back up McCarthy, because they need some insurance there. This is a win-now roster. A lot of observers didn't understand why they didn't just tag Darnold. Because then, yeah, you maybe have to pay him 30, 35 million, but they did have some cap space. It's a lot of money for a backup. They were basically like, we're going to
you could tell with the rhetoric coming out of there that the main thing was they were trying to test the market. They probably got it wrong based on what the Seahawks did. But they're like, the one thing we absolutely can't have happen is get stuck with him.
Right.
Which you could do if you franchise tag him, obviously. Right. So they had to move in a different, they probably preferred Daniel Jones straight up, as you're saying. One of the things here too, which I could be not accurate with this statement, but due to the recovery, I mean, they don't have a sense of what they have in JJ McCarthy in the same way that you would if you simply had sat the guy that you drafted, right? So there's a leap of faith here just in general because you don't know, but that's still taking a leap of faith is much safer than locking yourself into the caliber of play that will not let you meet your aspirations, which is what the Seahawks have just done.
What the Seahawks have done. Now, it has to be said, he got about 10 million less per year than what Geno is expected to get. It's effectively a 2-year deal, is my understanding. He's quite a bit younger. I got that response on social that like they probably went from Geno to Darnold because of age. At this caliber of QB, I don't care about age. You're thinking in short-term windows. Sam Darnold is not a guy that's going to be your 10-year answer. I mean, I just don't get that. You're probably thinking about this year and next year and trying to win with this current iteration of the roster, et cetera. Now, again, I think it was more about scheme fit. I think Seattle is doing frankly, again, a poor job of managing their roster because they're trying to fit player to scheme instead of scheme to your talent and your roster. And so they're trading away players that don't really fit their scheme, but they're making their team worse. And then they're hoping that, Clint Kubiak's going to come in and be the magic fix. And I just don't think that's the way that it's going to go. And again, I think Mike Macdonald's a very fascinating, young, great coach. I think this is going to go bad for the Seahawks, and I think he's going to get fired in 2 years. And I think that's a bummer because I wanted to see him be the Seahawks head coach for like 10 years. Now, I might be wrong entirely, been wrong on the Seahawks before. That's why I was asking you. I'm close to the situation from Seattle area. I'm not a big fan of the Seahawks, but I get asked by, like, everyone in my family is a fan of them. So I get asked by everyone about them. So I have a lot of opinions out there, and I'm biased by those opinions. I think this was all pretty poor. That's what I've been telling the people that are asking me that are close to the team and they want to know what to think about this. I'm like, man, I think they're heading towards the bottom of the division, basically, not towards the top. And I think they would have been better off if they're going to trade Geno and Metcalf really rebuilding and then maybe actually trying to get more in draft capital, even if it means 2026, whatever. Instead, they're going to try to compete, but I don't think they're going to be good enough to do so with the way that they've managed this roster. So again, as I said from the beginning, Seattle's moves are hard to follow for me. They might have more answers than I do, but my objective opinion on it when I'm trying to follow it is that they're not doing a very good job of managing talent. They're more concerned about this is the way we want to run our team. Maybe the scheme will elevate everything over top of all of that. It'll be fascinating. Sean, so then you have Geno in Vegas. Tell me about that. How does that affect our guy Brock Bowers?
I think it's fantastic for him. He's been very good throwing to his first read. I think the thing with the Raiders is simply that this is also frustrating, right? Because you're getting an option that doesn't allow you to keep up with the other teams in your division. You now have to be more powerful than them at all of the other spots or just across the roster, which, I mean, the Raiders are not there, right? So you're creating such a long-term project in part because you're impatient. And those are the things that we always kind of run into with NFL teams and their decision-making is that you simply can't rush it. But anytime that you take on lesser pieces just to get some safety for the upcoming year, it's a problem. But also the thing that you just mentioned, where you actively get less talented, that virtually never works out. So those two things are both problematic. That's an interesting situation. We have Justin Fields going to the Jets. One of the things that I would note there is that, yes, he's had some weaknesses as an NFL player, but this is one that when you look at a variety of metrics with Fields versus Jalen Hurts, there are a lot of statistical similarities. And one of the big things that's different is that Jalen Hurts has been surrounded by a far, far, far better team. I'm not saying that the Jets are necessarily going to be that right away, but certainly at different points, we've thought their defense was fairly strong. We felt like their head coach was scapegoated last season. We love Garrett Wilson. We know that Justin Fields had a good year with DJ Moore. That he had a good year with Cole Kmet. And we know that some of the things that you have to be able to do as a passing QB, if that's all you bring to the table, it's not that it's not great if you don't have both. That's one of the reasons why Jaden Daniels seems like he's ushered in this new era with the Commanders that is going to be sort of incomparable around the league. It's certainly one of the things that when Lamar Jackson takes the steps that he's taken throughout his career and gotten to the point that he's at now, again, you have the Ravens as this unstoppable offense. But when you're thinking about trying to do things offensively that will work, Fields as a star rushing QB allows you to do some things that even the good version of Sam Darnold, the good version of Geno Smith, you simply can't do, right? So it's, to me, and I've always liked Justin Fields, and so there's a little bit of bias here, but you look at the things that are working at the NFL level, and I would prefer to take this type of risk. Then when we look at Geno Smith, Sam Darnold, Aaron Rodgers, any of those three guys versus Justin Fields versus, say, and I don't know that a team is going to do this. There are some things about the Kirk Cousins situation that are still a little bit tricky to understand if you are an outsider. But take Kirk Cousins with either Jalen Milroe or Jackson Dart. What would be your preferences for both how you're spending your money and how you're actually creating a chance to win at the NFL level? Do you prefer the optionality of Cousins plus one of these sort of wild card but potentially viable rookies? Do you prefer the mobile guy? Do you prefer, I mean, we've already kind of talked about how you don't prefer these pocket passers who don't have enough left, but I think a lot of people would still prefer them to guys like Justin Fields or what we saw from Kirk Cousins, even if you pair him with controversial names like these rookies.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing for me is like one of the things that I realize when I talk to people about like the Sam Darnold signing that are more casual fans is that people do value just like getting better or just having a floor of competence. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's the same, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense to you. We talk about like basically just pure upside, right? Like how do we find ways to potentially win a Super Bowl, right? And you just talked about the Jalen Hurts potential with Fields. Okay, fine. He's not exactly the same player as Jalen Hurts. I know that there's a lot of people that are screaming about that. There's a lot of people that think Justin Fields is horrendous. A name that I brought up that is very, controversial for a ton of reasons, but Colin Kaepernick with the 49ers is a player when he was playing that people thought was horrible at playing quarterback. And yet he was such a dynamic runner that he ran for 181 yards and 2 touchdowns in a playoff win over the Packers on the way to a Super Bowl appearance in 2013. The next year, he had 2 playoff wins again, and then lost in the NFC Championship. This guy was 4-2 in 6 playoff games because of the stress that the mobility adds to the dynamic, right? When you're playing a really good team at a high level in the playoffs, all the things I just said about what Sam Darnold's not going to be able to do for you, as a pocket passer, you better have what Matthew Stafford was able to do late in that game against the Eagles. You better be Patrick Mahomes. You better be Joe Burrow. You better be able to absolutely rise to a obvious pass situation against great defenses and still throw and get chunk yards and score points, or else you're done. You're not going to win. You're going to win multiple playoff games. Now, one of the things you can do to win multiple playoff games when you're a mobile runner and these types of things is do it in different ways. Like some of these Colin Kaepernick playoff wins, he wasn't even running a ton. But I think it's interesting. The dynamic, Kaepernick and Fields are not particularly similar as players necessarily. Kaepernick a bigger player, etc. But what I think is interesting is the discussion that around Kaepernick, some of it was bad faith, whatever, but a lot of it was very serious analysts that are saying, no, Colin Kaepernick can't play quarterback. I'm like, well, he was good enough to play in the Super Bowl, right? To carry a team to the Super Bowl or lead a team at least. It's a good roster, as you were talking about. It's another one maybe on that Hurts dynamic, but if people think Hurts is too good to compare to Fields, this is, to me, is the upside of Justin Fields. I'm not saying he's definitely going to get there. We know that there are some issues with holding the ball too long, potentially with processing, potentially with getting it out. But when he does throw the ball, he's accurate. He has the ability to throw well.
Well, and to that point, Ben, when I say that there are statistical similarities, the things that I was specifically looking at, Sports Info Solutions for the 2024 season has these two guys with the exact same 77.7 on-target percentage. The ADOT for Fields just a tick deeper. And then the big thing that people always talk about, the sacks. Last year, he was 8.2%. Hurts was at 8.7%. A lower interception percentage, half for Fields. Now, the Steelers protected him in a way that probably also hurts your offense. But the Eagles did a lot of protecting of Jalen Hurts with what they were able to do with Saquon Barkley. I think that we've seen some things in the past from Jalen Hurts that would suggest that what you got in the playoffs was a more accurate version of him than what you got in the regular season. But there are some issues there. There have also been these moments of brilliance from Fields coming off of what he did with the Steelers. Even again, if they're protecting him, he wasn't playing with great talent around him in that situation for sure.
Yeah.
They protect him, but he puts up those numbers. It's surprising to me, actually, that he didn't get more. I know a lot of people are surprised that he got anything at all, that he got a starting job, that maybe he's not in the situation that Daniel Jones finds himself in.
Well, yeah, I mean, for a minute there, Schefter was talking about Fields as the one holding up the quarterback market. And I mean, that's fascinating because last year he was very gettable and apparently nobody wanted him. He got traded for really low, I can't remember, like a 4th round pick or something. And we couldn't believe that last year. And then he starts.
And teams tend to see something with him where they're like, he's having a good season. Let's go play a washed up, like completely incompetent version of Russell Wilson anyway.
Right. And then they go ahead and bench him. I mean, he got traded for nothing and then played a few weeks and then got benched. It was very surprising to me that he was viewed so favorably around the league going into this offseason relative to last year's valuation. That's the specific point. But we didn't understand last year's valuation. So, like, what is happening here? I don't know. But
especially because at least as we record this, it seems like Russell Wilson may be the odd man out entirely.
Right. It seemed like the Steelers prioritized Fields and wanted Fields back and didn't care if they got Russell back, which is, again, a weird thing. I think they were just managing his ego to a certain degree. Whole thing very interesting that by the end of the year, they decided the guy they really wanted to go forward with was Justin Fields. Why did you bench him last year? I think he probably would have been back if you would have played him. They seem to have wanted him back, and he reportedly was having reservations about going back to Pittsburgh unless they guaranteed him the starting job.
Then there's no way that if another team offers you a chance, especially one like the Jets, I mean, you have 0% chance you go back.
There's no way. But to Justin Fields' credit, this needs to be said. When he got benched, he said, the coach, he was nothing but supportive. He said the coaches make those decisions, and he said, if I put it on myself, basically, if I would have played better, I wouldn't have given them an opportunity to bench me at all, despite the fact that they were 4-2 and were in the 2 losses in those games. And he had played not great, but pretty good football. It was a little bit of a risk to just randomly go to Russell Wilson at that point, but Fields had done some things not perfect in the previous couple games, and he owned that. Now, in the offseason, in free agency, when he's the one making the decision, he's fully entitled to say, look, I'm not going to sign with you again unless I know that I'm going to be the starting quarterback. And I can't really trust you on that based on what happened last year. So I'm going to go sign with the Jets. I'm going to go sign with a team where their top wide receiver is a guy I threw to for 2 years in college. Garrett Wilson's freshman and sophomore year were with Justin Fields. They didn't play a ton together. Garrett Wilson didn't have a massive freshman year, and the sophomore year was the 2020 COVID year. They only had 8 games. So, I mean, they played together, but Wilson wasn't a massive part of the team when he was a freshman. And then he was really good in that sophomore year in the 8 games, but it was a shortened season is sort of my point. Wilson's best season comes the next year in 2021, but there's familiarity there. Now, as far as the impact on Wilson and Hall, we're going to get the Justin Fields element where there's going to be a high sack rate. You mentioned it's come down. It came down last year, but it's still high. It's going to be high, and he's going to scramble, which means a lot of called pass plays do not actually turn into pass attempts, which limits target upside. Now, you mentioned DJ Moore really consolidated that with Fields in the last season in Chicago. I think there's a possibility Garrett Wilson does get things more consolidated, but one of the interesting things with Wilson in the last couple of years, he's run a ton of routes. That's the way that he's kind of got there. He hasn't necessarily been the massive volume earner. I think that's more situational and some of the team level stuff. His routes are going to come down, and so that's not great for him. I do think he could consolidate more because what you get with a guy like Fields is a little bit more of that first read and run thing that can happen sometimes, or at least I think that's sort of where you might want to wind up with Fields. The other guy, Breece Hall, catches a ton of passes, a big part of his value. It's going to substantially hurt his dump off equity and receiving potential. It will help his rushing efficiency because you have Justin Fields' mobility as a significant element. This is going to be a fun team. I think it's a really fun bet for the Jets at this cost as far as the ceiling element of it. For fantasy football, the receptions, especially PPR leagues, are not going to necessarily be through the roof for Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall. It's a little bit of a bummer on that side. But as far as the NFL level, the competitiveness level, again, the reason I bring up the Kaepernick thing as well is that when he went to those playoff games, he elevated his play situationally based on certain schemes, based on certain situations. I mentioned he had a game where he ran for 181 yards and 2 touchdowns. It was a very famous win over the Packers. In 4 of his 6 games, he ran for at least 60 yards on the ground. He had 98 or more in 3 of his 6 games in the playoffs, his 6 playoff games that he played in. He had these big rushing performances. When you can pull that out in the games that matter the most, when you're putting everything on the line and threaten defenses in those ways. Now, I mean, they're doing a lot of read option stuff that was very different in 2013 and 2014 than it is in 2025. I don't know, man. I think the Fields upside is there. I think he can be dynamic enough. He's an explosive enough runner. I think a lot of people with your Hurts comp would bring up that, Hurts is such a consistent runner, and like a lot of the obviously the quarterback sneak stuff, but also the ways that they use him in the running game are like high success rate stuff, whereas Fields is maybe more boom bust when he holds the ball. When he gets loose, he's a dynamic, explosive runner. And maybe that's true to a degree, but the point is I
don't know if that necessarily hurts the Jets, though, because one of the issues that the Eagles ran into a lot this season was that in passing situations, if you could make Hurts scramble, both his ability to hurt you with his legs and his decision-making, they were both poor. You could certainly say that there have been issues with Justin Fields, that he's not perfect in that situation either. If you're going to take a lot of sacks that are not just like 3-yard sacks, but 20-yard sacks, I mean, those drives are essentially over then at that point, and you don't get that many drives in an NFL game. But I just think the dynamism actually, and I think this is what you were saying as well, but it actually goes to the Fields side of it, not to the Hurts side of it, especially if you have the offense built to take advantage of that. Then
because that's a high variance thing. If you get to 10-7 and get into the playoffs with Justin Fields, and you get to 10-7 and get in the playoffs with Sam Darnold, there's one team that I'm very confident is at best winning one game and then losing, but probably just a one and done playoff team. That's the Darnold side. There's another team that I'm like, man, if you tell me they rattled off multiple playoff upsets in a row, I at least can see that because of what you're describing. What if Justin Fields gets loose? What if he gets into one of these situations? Again, that's why I keep bringing up this 181-yard rushing, quarterback rushing game. But that was a situation where schematically they didn't have an answer, and it just broke the game. I mean, I remember watching that game 10 years ago. People remember this. He did it the next year against the Packers in the playoffs. Packers fans remember this. I guarantee it. But Fields could have that type of a playoff stretch, right? It wouldn't be. He's got to be better at reading the field and those things, but those things can come with reps and in better situations, as you were talking about. We see quarterbacks get better as they get closer to 30 sometimes, or beyond 30 at some of the reading defenses and those elements. I'm not saying he's definitely going to be great, but a bet on Justin Fields, there's way more logic, in my opinion, in this, at these prices specifically, much cheaper, discounted rate in betting on Fields versus betting on Sam Darnold at this point.
Garrett Wilson, 3 consecutive years with 215 plus fantasy points. This isn't a guy who's not scoring, right? But during that stretch, minus 100 fantasy points over expectation, minus 100. You go to DJ Moore and that 2023 season that I like to talk about, 288.5 points. Anytime you're starting to get to 300 points, even with the extra game, now that we have 17 game seasons, you start to close in on 300 points. You're making a huge impact. He was the wide receiver 6 that season, 53 fantasy points over expectation. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that Garrett Wilson is going to have his FPOE numbers jump by 30 or 40 or 50. But I think it's important to at least mention the fact that when you're talking about Garrett Wilson and the impact on him and where he has been from an FPOE perspective, and there are plenty of things that go into that, and some people will certainly, especially in the passing game, prefer some other stats. But it is, I think, fascinating when they get that large. And most of those were in the first 2 years, right? But when the numbers get that large, and then you're getting someone like a Justin Fields who is so maligned as a passer, and yet has had a guy, I mean, Ben, the other 4 seasons, but 2021, DJ Moore is at minus 27. Last year with Caleb Williams, he's at minus 5. I mean, this is a guy where, I mean, DJ Moore's so freakishly talented. For him to be putting up negative numbers with different quarterbacks and in different situations is just mind-boggling. Right now, we know that the Carolina Panthers were in a good situation. That's what the real deal is there.
But that's what arguably Garrett Wilson has dealt with. And Shawn, it's a very fascinating comp now that Fields is there and DJ Moore's the logical comp, because this is a guy that, I mean, before DJ Moore did that, we were big fans of. I was really into DJ Moore, and I was staying very clear that I thought he had bigger seasons in him. When I wrote up my targets per out run posts in January of this year, at the end of the year, I write them every year. I write about every team. When I wrote about Garrett Wilson, I talked about how his production has not been where we want it to be. I wrote his ADP should fall going into year 4, having yet to produce anything resembling the type of year I still do believe is in him. The closest comp I can give for Wilson personally is how I stayed steadfast in my belief DJ Moore was better than people realized, despite years of underperforming ADP and expectations early in his career. I think that's finally been vindicated later in his career, and yet Moore's eventual place in the wide receiver hierarchy is not as high as I would have guessed was possible in those very early years. Kind of had been talking through that maybe Garrett Wilson's ceiling isn't where I wanted it to be now after 3 years. But I think DJ Moore is the comp, the career comp at this point, or I did in January when I wrote this up.
300 points in 2025. I've backed off my statement that I am not going to throw out a controversial, ludicrous number there. There's no reason to be conservative, Ben. 300 points. I wanted to ask you, so Kirk Cousins, one of the things there, he's going to force himself out of Atlanta, right? Probably that wasn't the right way to phrase it, because one of the things, if I'm understanding the situation correctly, is that he's going to do everything he can to make sure he doesn't get put in the same situation he was in last year, which would be vaguely what you would get with Dart or Milrow. What about if you had signed Daniel Jones, not to compete with Anthony Richardson, where, I mean, if you're a Colts fan, you're thinking to yourself, Daniel Jones is going to beat him out, and then we're going to have to watch Daniel Jones. How is any of this good? Right? How is any of it good?
I wrote when I wrote this up, I wrote that I think that both of these teams are both these guys are going to probably be playing themselves off the field at varying points. I mean, that's what and they've made some other smart moves, and I still think Steichen can be interesting. And I want to be in on the Colts, and I did write what you wrote, that I think Jones' floor is higher and he winds up playing more as a result. But it's exactly what you just said, that like they're going to be kind of playing each other off the field or playing themselves off the field.
Well, and again, for anybody who thinks that we also just don't understand who Daniel Jones is, it's the flip of the Sam Darnold situation, where they were 30th in time to pressure. I mean, people just came streaming through. And so Daniel Jones had to make a decision. You got to get rid of the ball. He was 9th best in time to throw. The pressure rate was the 30th highest, even with that being the case, right? So that's not to say that Daniel Jones thrived or overcame the situation.
Right.
His on-target percentage wasn't great. We know that there are problems with Daniel Jones, But it is very apples and oranges when you're looking at Sam Darnold. He had to get rid of the ball quickly, and he did. The results weren't fantastic, or they weren't even decent. But there's a reason for that. Daniel Jones, from a talent perspective and from a competitive perspective, from a mobility perspective, there are lots of positives there to think that even though he's not going to be good, he's at the very least undervalued, or someone that you could, if you're a good coach, you could create a Sam Darnold season with him, or you could do the Kirk Cousins thing, or you sign someone and you also draft a first-round QB. And this is most relevant for the teams that simply are not in position to realistically draft Ward or Sanders. You needed to sign Daniel Jones, and you needed to then draft one of the other two guys.
And you brought that up earlier, and I did like that path as well. A cheap signing, and Cousins is going to probably be cheap. The way that I understand the Cousins thing, he's already, it's like dead money, like $27 million, and then he has $10 million more that's due on, I think, March 16th. It's 5 days from right now. And if they want to keep him as their backup, they have to pay him another $10 million roster bonus in like 5 days. And most everyone else around the league is like, we're not going to trade for him because you're going to cut him. You're not going to pay him $10 million more to back up Michael Penix. They're claiming they will. So we'll see what happens, but that they would then be paying him $37 million this year to be their backup. I don't know that they're going to do that, but we'll see what happens there. If they do cut him, then I think there's, you get the element where he may then sign a smaller contract, like the Russell Wilson thing, where because of all the dead money, like Wilson ended up signing a really small deal with the Steelers. I don't know exactly how it pans out. But that was, you had asked it with Cousins and a potential rookie or Daniel Jones, a cheap, low cost sort of bridge veteran with one of those rookies, I think is a perfectly fine, throw multiple bets at it, viable, play into uncertainty. That's one of the things about the Sam Darnold thing that I was trying to emphasize, that he had 55 starts that were so bad across multiple teams, across different coaches with the Jets and multiple teams then, is that people believe that just because we have a sample, that it's a good sample, basically. You get to this point where it's like, oh, he turned it around. He had one good year, so he's obviously improved. It's like, man, you have a lot of data on this guy that says he's not good, actually, is what you have. I want to bet on uncertainty. I'd rather bet on Justin Fields, where we don't have a lot of starts from him either in reality, when you look at the whole body of work for him, but especially in any kind of reasonable situation. That's basically just what we saw with him with the Steelers last year. Now, I know people will say that Darnold's situation with the Jets was really unreasonable too. Fair. But he's played more. He has played more and has not shown really any growth over a long period of time until last season, or he hadn't until last season, I should say. Anyway, the bridge QB plus rookie situation, I like that. I think it's a great call. The thing you're saying about Daniel Jones, even if he's a below average passer, like we're not saying he's a great player. We're not. Both of us are saying he's probably going to play himself off the field to a certain degree. But we talked about this recently. Anthony Richardson had a 47% completion percentage last year. Not even just because he was throwing deep. He just misses throws. His on-target numbers are horrible. All of that. It's going to be rough for him to ever be a consistent starter when he doesn't have accuracy. People say you can coach accuracy. I don't think you can. I've often said I think accuracy is the most important trait when I'm looking at like prospects, because I do think you need to be able to throw with some kind of feel and anticipation and get the ball where it needs to be. Now, you've talked about how you can overcome that in certain situations, like the Jalen Milroe situation. His accuracy is not on Anthony Richardson's level, but accuracy is important, man. Like you're talking about it as an overcome. And if it's a plus, that's why we liked Bo Nix last year. This guy was accurate at all levels. People said, oh, he only throws underneath. He was accurate underneath. And then he was also accurate down the field. He broke the completion percentage record in college football history. Because he puts the ball where he wants to put it. That's going to play up usually with a good coach, with a good scheme, if you get those types of things around you. And it mostly did last year. So anyway, the accuracy stuff is
the accuracy Jones too. You're getting a lot of reporting right now about how he's going to be working with biometrics coaches and what have you to rebuild the throwing motion. I really hope it works for him, because you hope it works for everybody. And when we say that it's not a good move for the team or that you shouldn't draft this player, one of the things that always gets tough is that then, as an analyst, your accuracy and status is on the line by whether or not you were right. But at the same time, we still want all of these guys to succeed. I hope that it works. But my thought would be, based on observation of football, but also multiple other sports that have these types of tricky movements. You think about tennis, one of the things you can do in a tennis environment is you can take people who are incredible ball strikers and have a flaw in their mechanics, and you can fix the mechanics and you can make them an even better ball striker, an even better tennis player. You can't take a great athlete and fix their mechanics and take someone who cannot hit a tennis ball in or hit the tennis ball where they want it, change their mechanics and make them be able to do that. Right now, again, we're talking about some differences here in terms of like how much exposure. Beginners are a different story. But when you're talking about people who have played the sport a lot, people who are very good at it can make all kinds of mechanical changes and technique changes and improve their game in small amounts that can be very meaningful, because a small amount is the difference between losing in the first round and winning the Super Bowl, right? But you simply don't see people who have a lot of experience in a sport, whether it's hitting a baseball, hitting a tennis ball, throwing things, where they simply cannot perform the action that is being required of their position or their sport, and then you work on the mechanics and they can suddenly do it. That just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's just a really challenging thing to imagine. Daniel Jones, not an above average accuracy guy, but again, you can balance that with, he's got some mobility. It's going to be a significant difference to go from 47% completion. I mean, really bottom of the barrel accuracy up to Daniel Jones. That's good. And I think that's ultimately why we're both saying it probably plays out in Jones' favor over time. But yeah, to your point, I mean, going that way with I go back to the Darnold thing. One of the things I wound up saying to some of my friends in the Seattle area was, I do think one of the ways this works out, somebody brought up Matt Flynn. They're like, well, maybe it's just like the Matt Flynn signing, which famously the Seahawks paid him a decent amount of money and then drafted Russell Wilson in the third round and then just started Russell Wilson from day one. Darnold's deal is effectively a 2-year deal. It was about $10 million a year less than what Geno Smith was expecting. If they go out and get a Jackson Dart or a Jalen Milroe or something, maybe they do what the Falcons did to Kirk Cousins last year with
That's
the Michael Penix
still a lot of money, and
it is,
and it hurts your overall roster building.
Oh, it does. It hurt the Falcons. The Falcons were one of those teams that ended up having to make a cut. They had to cut Grady Jarrett, a longtime stud for them, who immediately got a huge deal from the Bears, and he's no longer a Falcon in part because of what they did last year, signing Cousins to a huge deal and drafting Penix, which a lot of people talked up as a good move because you get these two swings at quarterback, etc. There's effects on that. You don't have unlimited money. The cap is real. There was a lot of people in Atlanta that were like bummed. I saw some of the Atlanta people that I follow. One of them I saw say something like, I don't want to live in a world where Grady Jarrett's not a Falcon. I mean, it was a bummer, I mean, that's a fan favorite for Falcons fans. And I mean, there's effects on those things, but that's how negative I am about the Darnold signing. But I do think your general approach there makes a lot of sense. You don't want to do it with Darnold because of the cost. The Seahawks have already signed Darnold. So I'm saying, well, maybe they'll also go after their future QB. Who knows? But if you have a Daniel Jones and one of those guys, like you were saying, or a Cousins who comes in cheaply and one of those guys, I think it's a reasonable approach because you're at least leaning into the uncertainty plus, some degree of a floor with some of those veterans. Anyway,
then we got to get you to some family evening activities. This is where we're going to pause it. Did you have any rattle off super quick takes that you wanted to finish with?
No, I think we did a good job covering all the stuff that I feel strongly about. There's a lot of stuff that we need to talk about, which we will, as it relates to, some of the, really there's a lot of wide receiver stuff to talk about, man. I want to talk more about Debo with Washington and then what's left in San Francisco. I talked to you, I think a little bit before the show about some Ricky Pearsall stuff. I'll give you that as a hot take. Ricky Pearsall is pretty expensive as a year 2 bet. This is a guy who's already 25 years old. He was a really old prospect, never had 1,000 yards in college, only had 50 catches in his redshirt senior season. Yeah, he got shot last year, which complicated his rookie year. But when he got back healthy, he played 3 games where he was getting some volume. And then as soon as McCaffrey came back, basically he was playing a lot, but basically did not get anything. Got like 3 targets and no catches on like 3 straight weeks or across like 3 straight weeks. Then McCaffrey gets hurt again. He still only has like 1 catch in a couple more games. And then his season ends with some big games really late that they lose anyway. And they already kind of knew their season was done. They wanted to get their first rounder going. He winds up with a 14.4% targets per route, Sean. Runs a lot of empty routes last year. Juwan Jennings thrived given the available opportunity last year, 25.7% targets per route run. That was the type of season that indicated that the Niners needed someone to step up. They didn't have McCaffrey for most of the year. They had Ayuk get hurt early in the year. And most of Pearsall's routes came after Ayuk was hurt. I think he's an overpay right now. He's going really high. I would be betting on Jennings. I think you have Ayuk coming back at some point. You're going to probably get more snaps out of CMC this year. You still have a really great player in George Kittle. This is still not uncrowded situation. People are thinking Debo's gone, so that means the last year's first-round rookie has to step up. He's below those guys on the target pecking order for me in terms of what they've performed. Having said that, what Jennings did last year and what Jennings' profile was prior is the blueprint for a, there's certainly an upside and uncertainty with Pearsall. But we got to talk about some other receivers too. We got to talk about Metcalf. We got to talk about Devontae Adams. We got to talk about Christian Kirk in Houston. There's so many moves that have happened. We haven't had a chance to get to all of them. It's fascinating to think about all this stuff. I've had a great time talking with you about, what these teams are doing, where they're going, what it's going to mean for how successful they'll be this year. Yeah. Anyway, you got any last minute hot takes?
This is beside the point, but when you were talking about Pearsall not being a big producer in college, I wanted to mention that it seems like Emeka Egbuka is going to go very early in the NFL draft. And again, like I was saying with Anthony Richardson, I hope that everything about him that I don't quite get is accurate. But he's someone where he evaded 26 tackles in the 3 main seasons that he played. Jackson Smith and Jigba evaded 26 tackles in 2021. Egbuka has 1 100-yard game in his last 26 appearances, and it came against Marshall. JSN finished the 2021 season with 8 consecutive games of 97 or more yards, including games of 200 and 300, while mostly playing with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, notably the 300-yard game they were sitting out. But production matters. We'll see where all these guys are. That was a fun way to end. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, different places. But the main thing, bengretch.substack.com. Get over to Stealing Signals. Make sure you get the post he just put out, breaking down what we talked about today, and then all of those things we didn't talk about in free agency. I'm Shawn Siegele. We'd love to have you guys over RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio2025 for 10% off. But the big thing, the rookie guide, and then the big discount in the rookie guide for a new RotoViz subscription. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.